Okie dokie. So, yeah, hi, I'm Mhairi. What to tell you? So yes, I was involved in developing this synthesis without meta-analysis reporting guidance. We received funding from Cochrane to develop it. So as I was part of the team, I guess the only conflict of interest I'd like to report is that I'm one of the team that thinks hopefully this is quite useful. Apart from that, I don't think I've got any other conflicts of interest to report. Oh, I'm just trying to move my slides on. Oh dear. I think I'll need to stop sharing for a moment.
Yeah, if you just want to restart that, that's okay.
Sorry about this. You'd think after 3 years I might have learned, but not quite yet. Right, I'm sharing my screen. It's the moving forward it's just not working. I'm really sorry about this.
And you just have them sharing. Yep, there you go.
Just the buttons wouldn't move and now they do. Anyway, really sorry about that. So what I'm going to talk to you today is not how I can't share slides or properly share my slides, is I'm going to tell you about talk to you about deciding whether or not to do a meta-analysis in the first place. And then I'll explain what these alternative synthesis methods are. And something to point out is that today I'm talking about synthesis of quantitative effect data. So I'm not going to be talking about qualitative data. There's lots of guidance out there about how to conduct and how to report that form of data. So this is all about quantitative data that has come from intervention studies. And then the third part of the talk is going to be about what we can do to be as transparent and as rigorous in this alternative synthesis when we're not using meta-analysis. So first of all, deciding whether or not to do a meta-analysis. So one thing to point out is that even though it depends on what field you work in, it is possible that when we see a systematic review, it always comes with a meta-analysis. So it's just to point out the fact that the systematic review has some form of synthesis in it, and that's a meta-analysis, but it needn't necessarily be a meta-analysis. So just to point out that it is possible to have a systematic review without a meta-analysis, because sometimes if you see reviews always with both of them, people think that it's that they always come together, but that's not necessarily the case. Another thing to point out is that even in reviews that have data that comes from randomized control trials, which tends to give a data that's most amenable to going into a meta-analysis, it's been found that only around a half of them actually have a meta-analysis. And so that means that the other half of the reviews are actually doing something different. They're either doing some other form of synthesis or they don't have any synthesis at all. So that points out that actually having a systematic review from these studies with quantitative data is actually really common. So it is quite likely, if we work with these types of studies, that we're going to come across a situation when we can't do the meta-analysis. So thinking about, would we do a meta-analysis or not? Reasons for not doing a meta-analysis, not knowing how to do the synthesis, that's not a valid reason. So if we don't know how to do the synthesis, we need to go get the books out or drag somebody onto the review team that does know how to crunch the numbers. But what can happen is that we don't have data to actually do the meta-analysis. We might have effect sizes from the studies, but we don't have the additional numbers that we need to do the meta-analysis. So in that situation, instead of doing nothing, we want to make best use of the evidence so we can use these alternative forms that I'll talk about a bit in a moment. Another reason, and it's highlighted in this paper that I've noted here for you, the title of the paper is Reasons or Excuses for Avoiding Meta-Analysis and Forest Plots. So you can see where the authors are coming from, that they think people are trying to avoid doing the meta-analysis sometimes. Sometimes people, when faced with the diversity of the studies, they think that it wouldn't be appropriate to do meta-analysis. However, these authors and many others say that if it's possible to do a meta-analysis, then do go ahead and do that meta-analysis, but be really careful in how the data are interpreted, the results of the meta-analysis are interpreted, and there might have to be further subsequent analysis to investigate that heterogeneity. So even though I'm talking today about these alternative forms of synthesis to meta-analysis, I'm not at all saying that there's anything wrong with meta-analysis, and I encourage people to do it when they can, but for whatever reason you find yourself not able to do the meta-analysis, then there is now help, guidance on how to do that meta-analysis. So if we find ourselves in the situation of thinking, right, I can't do the meta-analysis, I need to use some of these other forms of synthesis, there's now guidance on how to do that synthesis in chapter 12 of the Cochrane Handbook. So in that chapter, they give information about when we might do these types of synthesis and how to do the synthesis, and also worked examples for each of the methods. And then that's how to do the synthesis. And then we developed, the project I was involved in was developing how to report the synthesis that we did, and that's the SWiM guidance. So there's two strands to the guidance. There's how to actually do the synthesis, that you get the information in chapter 12 of the Cochrane Handbook, and then there's the SWiM guidance on how to report the synthesis that we've done. So there is a web page that's got links to these resources, which are completely free for people to access and use, and other further resources to guide you through the SWiM guidance. So on the last slide, I'll have information about these, so you don't need to note them just now, and also we can share the slides on the information. So the SWiM guidance has 9 reporting items, and each of these are there to prompt people to think about what do we need to report in our reviews to be as clear as possible about what we've done for this synthesis. So the very first item on that list deals with heterogeneity that's really likely, we're really likely to come across when we deal with these types of studies, particularly if we're looking at reviews examining population health or public health. So there's this diversity in the studies, and that leads people to think, well, how do these studies are really different? How am I going to combine them to do some synthesis to actually be able to bring the studies together and find something useful from bringing the studies together? And we have a saying in the UK that apples and oranges are not the same thing. So that's to kind of say, well, if one study is about apples, if one group of studies are about apples and one group of studies or another study is about oranges, it doesn't make sense to bring them together. So what the guidance suggests is, no, apples and oranges are not the same thing, but they are both fruit. So it could be that by looking at the studies at a more broad level or a higher level, then we are able to find some way of finding something in common that makes it rational and legitimate to actually group these studies together and therefore be able to do some form of synthesis. So rather than doing nothing, we're able to make some use of the data that's there. And so that's what the very first item in the SWiM reporting guidance is on. So when we're conducting the synthesis, we'll be trying to decide how to group the studies. And when we're thinking about that, we will consider things like the characteristics of the studies, the study designs, the risk of bias. But the main thing probably that we want to consider is how do we group the studies in such a way that's useful for the people who we intend to use the findings of our review? What's going to be useful to the decision makers? And so that's, for that reason, we would hope that there was either an expert on the topic on the review team, or that we consult with topic experts to make sure that that the structure of our synthesis is in such a way that the synthesis makes best use of the evidence for the evidence users. So that's the main thing that we want to think about when we're grouping the studies. And then when we're reporting that synthesis, we want to make sure we really clearly and transparently explain to the review reader how the studies have been grouped and give the rationale for why they were grouped like that. So now, after repeatedly talking about these alternative methods to synthesis, I'll explain what they are. So if we want to find out what synthesis methods we have available to us, what we have to first do is we have to identify what standardized metrics do we have available to us in the included studies we have in our review. So standardized metric, in case that's a bit of an alien term for you. Well, when we're synthesizing, we want to, on some level, we want to find something common to the studies or data. So you can't combine a mean with an odds ratio because they're two different measurements. So in the meta-analysis, we synthesize standardized effect sizes. So what we want to do is we want to try and find these standardized or common measurements. So if we're working with quantitative data from these studies, then there's 3 different types of standardized or common metric that might be available to us. So what we want to do in the included studies is look at the data there and identify what we have available to us with the studies that we have. And the standardized metrics that we might have are effect sizes, but there's a reason that we can't do the meta-analysis. So the studies are given us the effect sizes, but not the additional information we need. Or they might give us, well, I'm sure they will give us an indication of the direction of effect the study finds, or they might give us p-values. So a bit more about each of these metrics. I think everybody will be familiar with effect sizes. That's things like risk ratios, odds ratios, standardized mean differences. The direction of effect is the study reporting in favour of the intervention or treatment, or is it reporting in favour of the control, or is it saying it found no effect? And if the studies are reporting p-values, we'd be looking for one-sided p-values, and for those p-values to all reflect the same directional hypothesis. So then when we look at our studies, included studies, and see which standardized metrics they have available to us, that's going to point us in the direction of which synthesis methods we could use. So if the studies give us the effect sizes, with the caveat there's a reason we're not doing the meta-analysis, then the synthesis method we can use is we can summarize the effect sizes. If the studies give us the direction of effect, we can conduct folk counting based on direction of effect. Or if the studies are giving us p-values, we can combine p-values. So that's the 3 alternative synthesis methods: summarizing effect sizes, folk counting of studies based on direction of effect, or combining p-values. So a bit more about each of these. So when we're summarising the effect sizes, we do that when we have the estimates of the intervention effect. We have the effect sizes. And what that will look like is we'll be giving descriptive statistics such as the median, the range, and the interquartile range for those studies combined. If we conduct folk counting based on direction of effect, then we do that when we only have the direction of effect of the studies, or there's no consistent effect measure or data reported across the studies. So instead of using those data, we're dealing instead with the direction of effect. And what that looks like is we'll be reporting the overall benefit or harm based on the direction of effect. So just a wee bit more detail about that is that when we decide whether or not the study is reporting a benefit, is it reporting in favour of the intervention, we don't just count the studies or look at the studies that are reporting a statistically significant result. We want to include in the benefits category all the studies that report a benefit, even if it's not statistically significant. So all of this information is in chapter 12 of the Cochrane Handbook, and they have a section that will explain why we don't just focus on statistically significant, but it skews the results if we only focus on the statistically significant studies, because there'll be some studies that the characteristics of the study mean it would never have the power to become statistically significant, and they would be not counted. So read the section in chapter 12, I think they'll convince you. So that's folk counting based on direction of effect, tallying up the studies that were found to be beneficial and compared to the studies that favoured the control or were considered harm. And the third synthesis method is combining p-values. So we can do that when we have the p-values and the direction of effect of the studies, or the outcomes and statistical tests differ across the studies, or the studies report non-parametric tests. And then what we want is we want to use one-sided p-values or be able to convert the two-sided p-values to one-sided p-values. So that's the three synthesis methods. And as I say, if we find ourselves in the situation of thinking, oh, can't do the meta-analysis, so I'm going to have to use one of these alternative methods, and you want details about exactly what to do and how to do it, then chapter 12 is where the guidance is for it. And also last autumn, the authors, Joe Mackenzie and Sue Brennan, led a webinar with the Cochrane Methods Support Unit where they provided further information, additional guidance on how to do these methods. So that's a really useful webinar, particularly in conjunction with the chapter. So again, that's the YouTube link there, but again on the very last slide, and we can share the links to access that because it's really useful. So something to note is that depending on which synthesis method we use, they're each answering a slightly different question. And that can be something that's useful to bear in mind when we're doing the synthesis and also when we're reporting the synthesis. So if we had been conducting a meta-analysis, we'd be answering the question, what's the average effect? So, but if we were summarising the effect sizes, the question is different now. We're answering the question, what's the range and distribution of effects? If we're folk counting, then we're answering the question, is there any evidence of an effect? We're no longer going to be able to tell the reader of an average effect. And if we're combining p-values, the question that we're answering is there evidence that there's an effect in at least one study? So this again is set out in the chapter 12, and it's something to bear in mind as we're writing up the review. So now I'll say a bit more about how we can be as transparent as possible when we're using these alternative methods. So before this new guidance was available, there wasn't a lot of detailed guidance there. So it was really common to come across reviews where it would say we couldn't do a meta-analysis and we conducted a narrative synthesis and nothing else is said, which is understandable because there wasn't much guidance on what we should be doing and what we should be saying. But if a meta-analysis had been conducted, we would completely expect particular details of that analysis to be clearly reported. So the same's true for these alternative methods. We need to be clear in what we're doing. And the reason for that is if we don't clearly explain what methods we've used, then the reader isn't able to assess what was done to synthesize the data. So if we just say, oh, we narratively synthesized and then come up with some findings, then that can leave the reader suspicious. So if we're not able to analyze what was done to synthesize the data, then the reader doesn't know whether they can trust the review findings. So that has the knock-on effect of, even if the methods used were completely robust, if they're not clearly reported, then the reader isn't aware that robust methods have been used. So that can result in a lack of trust in otherwise high quality reviews. So that's what we want to avoid. And that's why it's so important to clearly report what we've done. And sometimes us as reviewers, as review authors, as we're writing up, it can seem so obvious what was done. So it's sometimes we forget to spell it out for the review users. So as I've been talking, I've talked through the first three reporting items, and now I'm going to talk about a little bit about another three of them, the basic items, the main basic items of this reporting guidance. So a bit about data presentation methods. So when we have these reviews, it is really important to have some way of presenting the data all together in some form. And that might be as simple as having a table or tables. And for those tables to give key information about all of the included studies together in one place, so that the reader, as they read through the narrative text, can look at the key points of the studies all together and be better able to follow the flow of the synthesis. So having one table with key information such as the populations, the outcomes that we were looking at, the study designs and the risk of bias of those studies. And then depending on our particular review focus, there might be information such as study size or setting that are particularly important and we want to also include in the table. And then also we might have in that table or a separate findings table, key pieces of information along with the main study findings all together, all the included studies together in one place. And something that seems quite simple, but it's really useful, is if we have a characteristics of studies table, the thing that we all tend to do is to organize them nice and tidily, alphabetically by the first author name. But it can absolutely practically guarantee you that that's not what the synthesis, that's not how the synthesis is structured. It's highly unlikely. So instead of doing that alphabetical, it's far more helpful to the reader to organize the information in tables in this to as much as possible match how the synthesis has been formatted in the narrative text. So the structure of the synthesis for the data presentation to as much as possible reflect that. For example, if the studies were grouped into 3 different intervention categories, then for the studies in the characteristics table to be organized like that can be, it's really simple, but it's really helpful for the reader to follow what's happened. And that's important for the reader to follow what's happening and trust our review. So this slide is a bit of an attempt to get a little bit of colour into this presentation. So as well as tables, there are other forms of data presentation that we can use when we have this type of data, or these types of data. It may be that if we have the data available to populate a forest plot, then maybe we could use that for presentation purposes. It wouldn't have the diamond showing the overall effect size because we wouldn't have done the meta-analysis. But maybe for whatever reason it would be, if we have all that data and yet we're not doing the meta-analysis, we could present it in a forest plot because people are fairly familiar with being able to read a forest plot. So maybe that's a possibility. If we're working with effect directions, then we could use effect direction plots or harvest plots. Or if we're working with effect sizes, we might use box and whisker plots or bubble plots. And if we're working with p-values, there's such a thing as an albatross plot. So this, we don't need to take in any of these numbers at all. This is just a picture of a forest plot that's been used for presentation purposes. It's from a Cochrane review. And they have used it to set out the data, but they didn't do the meta-analysis on this. And here is an example of an effect direction plot. So I'll give you a few details about this, because if we're working with effect directions, it can be a really useful way of bringing together a lot of information in one place. And so the reader can read through the narrative text of the review and refer back to this table. So a few key things about it. The first column is setting out all the studies that were included. Each row is a study. And if you see just underneath this, the ring around author year, it says intervention, warmth and energy efficiency improvements. So actually this is a snapshot of a much longer table, and the studies for the synthesis were grouped into intervention categories. And so that's what's been done in this table to match the synthesis. What else do we have? On the right-hand side, the last three columns of the table are showing the effect direction plots. So the triangles are the plots. So pointing up the wee triangle was a positive health outcome. Pointing down the wee triangle was a negative health outcome, or the study reporting in favour of the control. Two triangles pointing in either direction horizontally was no effect was reported. Empty V triangles where the effect direction was reported, but there was no accompanying statistics. And then the letters and numbers are further details, further caveats or details that were included in the footnotes. And there's far more information also included. So as this is a slightly older review, so at the time they talked about study quality, these days would probably be reporting it as risk of bias. But that's reported as well. And as well as the studies being organised into intervention groups, then the studies within that are ordered by the study quality. So the best studies are put to the top, and that's how the studies were discussed in the synthesis. So it's, and there's further information such as the study design, how many people were involved, how participants were in each of the studies, etc. So it's a lot of information in one place, and quite useful if we're working with effect directions. So a bit about what we want to consider when we're reporting the results. So when we're reporting a summary of the results, there's three key things that we want to remember to report. We want to make sure that we report the nature of the question that was addressed if you remember, we're saying that depending on what method we've used, slightly different question has been answered. So we need to make sure that we reflect that in our summary. So if we're not doing the meta-analysis, we're not giving an average effect size. So make sure that the language matches what we've actually done. We want to clearly report the standardized metric and the synthesis method used. If we have several pieces of synthesis we might have used with different data available within those groups, we might have used more than one alternative method. So we want to clearly say what methods we have used. And then for each outcome and comparison, each piece of synthesis we do, we need to make sure that we reference which studies were included in those pieces of analysis. In a meta-analysis, it would be clearly pointed out, we'd hope, which studies went into that piece of analysis. So it's equally important that when we use these alternative forms of synthesis, that we reference those studies and make it really clear. And then the final item that I'll talk about just now is recognising the limitations of these synthesis methods. So when we write up our review, and we'll have the limitations of the review that we've done, it may be something, perhaps there was limitations in the search parameters or something like that. We talk about that, and we also might be talking about the limitations of the included studies. It's also a good idea to recognise the limitations of the synthesis methods that we've used here. So that would be considering the standardised metric and the synthesis methods, and also if we had to change, or we did change, how the studies were grouped. And the reason that we want to recognise these limitations is because they can have implications for what questions can be answered and how the synthesis can be interpreted. So, for example, the standard, if we haven't done a meta-analysis, so we're not giving the reader information about the average intervention effect size. Instead, we're telling them about, is there any evidence of an effect? And that's something that is just best practice, that we make that clear to the reader, that these alternative synthesis methods, they're making best use of the evidence, but they're not giving effect size, they're not giving an indication of the magnitude of the effect. So we should recognise that. And then if it is the case that since the protocol we had to change how we group the studies, for instance, in the protocol we might have wanted to have that group of studies about apples and the group of studies about oranges, but then there weren't enough studies to actually do any synthesis. So it made sense to, rather than having no synthesis, for our particular review, we decided we would group them into a group about fruit. Then we're doing the best we can with the review, but we should recognise that that means that we can no longer probably no longer talk about the outcomes for the oranges studies. We're now talking about fruit, so we should make that clear if we made those changes from what we intended to do in the protocol. And I'm not going to talk about them right now, but there are 3 other reporting items that are a little bit more nuanced, and there's information about them along with all the rest of them in the guidance papers and the resources that are there. But I think that's a reading list, and I think I'll stop there for now. And we'll be able to share this reading list if you're interested, in the links to the Cochrane Methods webinar as well. So you don't need to write it down just now if you don't need to. So I'll stop sharing right now,